Beg for a marriage that already died, who belongs beside me.
You'll get used to being forgotten.
You just lost the woman I'd spend my fortune protecting. Nora.
He discarded wife for a rich heiress. On divorce day, the Heiress's billionaire proposed her before him. Before this story begins, you need to know one thing about Nora Calloway. She was not, by nature, a woman who stayed quiet. Her father, Raymond Calloway, had raised her to think clearly, speak her mind, and never confuse being gracious with being a pushover. She had an architecture degree from Columbia. She had worked 2 years at her father's firm in Midtown before she met David Whitfield at a colleague's dinner party and fell, quickly and without warning, in love with a man who made her feel genuinely seen in a room full of people. What she had not anticipated was how slowly a certain kind of life can reshape you, not all at once, not dramatically, just by degrees so small that you do not register any single one until you are standing in a kitchen at 33, looking at who 7 years of quiet adjustments have made you, trying to remember when exactly you started making yourself smaller to keep the peace. When David told her he was leaving her for Celeste Harrington, Nora said, "All right," 2 words, steady voice. Sunday evening in their kitchen. She did not ask him to reconsider. She did not tell him what she already suspected about Celeste, because she was not ready to use it yet, and she was not someone who reached for a weapon before she needed one. She spent the next 3 months handling paperwork, moving into a smaller apartment, and waiting for a Thursday morning in October when the whole thing would be legally finished. She had a plan for what came after. She had been building it carefully. What she did not have a plan for was what happened in the hallway outside the conference room on her way out. Nobody plans for a man waiting at the elevator with a velvet box. Nobody plans for the moment when everything that was done to you starts to make sense as a single, deliberate design, and you understand not just what was taken, but who came for it and why. Nora did not plan for any of it. She handled it anyway. Chapter 1. What he signed away on a Thursday morning. Nora had not cried in 11 days. The last time was in the kitchen of the West Village apartment she had been renting since August, a place small enough that she could hear the neighbor's television through the wall, and quiet in a way that had nothing comforting about it. After 7 years in a brownstone with working fireplaces and a garden in the back, she had sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine she never touched and let herself feel all of it, not piece by piece, the way she had been managing things for months, but all at once. Every dinner party, she had smiled her way through without saying what she actually thought. Every time she had filed down an opinion because David's comfort in a room mattered more than her honesty in it. Every morning she had woken up next to a man who was no longer quite looking at her and told herself that this particular stretch of patience would eventually pass. She had cried until there was nothing left, then washed her face and gone to bed. That was 11 days ago. Today was Thursday. Diane Park was already in the lobby when Nora pushed through the building's front door at 8:55, which was not a surprise. Diane had been Nora's closest friend since they were 22 and splitting a 400-square-foot apartment on Avenue A, back when neither of them had enough money for the security deposit and both of them had more nerve than sense. She had the rare gift of knowing when a person needed to be talked to and when they simply needed someone to be in the room. She took one look at Nora in her gray coat with her hair pulled back and her face composed in the way it got when she had made a decision that could not be unmade, and said, "You look terrifying," in Diane's vocabulary. This was the highest possible form of encouragement. They rode the elevator up without saying much. 14 floors. The reception area opened into the kind of space designed to hold difficult moments without leaving marks on anything. Neutral walls. Good light. A receptionist who smiled without asking unnecessary questions. Diane found a chair near the window and crossed her legs and appeared to be looking at her phone while actually watching everything. For a few minutes, the morning was purely procedural, and Nora was grateful for it. Procedure had carried her through a great deal in the past 3 months. She was reviewing the rest of her day when the elevator behind her chimed. She did not look immediately. Elevators chimed for many people. Then Diane made a sound, small and involuntary, the kind a person makes when they see something they were not expecting and have not yet decided what to do about it. Nora turned. David was there, in the charcoal suit she had helped him choose 3 years ago for a conference in Boston. She noticed that detail and set it aside, standing next to him, with her hand settled in the crook of his arm and the ease of a woman who has never once in her life had to make an effort to be noticed, was Celeste Harrington. Nobody had arranged for this. It was not in any document, not mentioned in any correspondence between their attorneys. This was a procedural signing. There was no practical reason for anyone to bring a companion, and if someone had chosen to, the obvious professional courtesy would have been to let her wait downstairs. Nora processed in about 4 seconds exactly what Celeste's presence was and what it was designed to communicate. She had come to stand in the same room as the woman she had replaced, next to the man who had chosen her, and let the full weight of that arrangement do its work. It was deliberate. It was precise. Nora had considered this possibility and decided in advance how she was going to handle it. She stood and said David's name and moved toward the conference room. The notary was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and the manner of someone who has done this work long enough to understand that the best thing she can offer anyone is competence and the complete absence of commentary. The documents were organized and tabbed. Celeste was directed to the chair near the window, gently but clearly. Since she had no role in the proceeding, she sat with her ankles crossed and her spine straight, and the air of someone choosing, as a deliberate exercise in generosity, to allow the arrangement. Diane had planted herself quietly in the doorway, and the notary, assessing Diane's expression, had not pursued the matter. They signed, page after page. David signed, and then Nora signed. And the strange thing she kept noticing was that her handwriting looked completely normal, clean and consistent, the same as it always had been, as if her hand had not been informed that this was supposed to feel like the end of something. The notary stepped out to make copies. The room held 3 people and a 4th near the window, and the sound of the city outside, and a silence that nobody moved to fill. Celeste filled it. Her voice was warm, the specific warmth of a woman who has said unkind things in kind tones so many times that she no longer hears the gap between them. "I really do hope you find some peace after all this," she said, directing the words at Nora with a small concerned tilt of her head. "You have so much to offer, Nora. People find their footing eventually, and now you can focus on yourself for once. Figure out who you are without all the weight of this." She gestured vaguely at the documents, the room, all of it. "Something will come along. It always does." The words were designed to accomplish 2 things at once. On the surface, kindness. Underneath, as precise and deliberate as a needle pressed under the palm. A reminder. You are the one who lost. You are a woman who has not yet figured out who she is. And this room full of professionals is watching you start over. Nora looked up from the document. She looked at Celeste for one full, unhurried beat in which nothing moved in her face. "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "That means a lot, coming from someone who worked so hard to be in this room." A silence followed. 2 seconds, maybe 3, but in a room that quiet, 2 seconds has weight. It was the silence of something aimed precisely at a target that was not there, and Celeste's expression did not change, but the warmth behind it went somewhere else for a moment before it came back. Diane, in the doorway, saw every second of it, and stored it carefully. Nora looked back at her document and signed the last page. The notary returned. The proceeding was concluded with the appropriate official language. They filed out into the corridor. Nora was 3 steps from the elevator when she saw him. He was standing near the far end of the hallway by the elevator bank, in a dark overcoat with his hands in his pockets. He had not been there when they arrived. She placed his face in about 2 seconds because it was not a face you forgot once you had seen it. Marcus Hale. They had met once, at a benefit gala 2 years before, where he had shaken her hand and said her father's name with genuine recognition, and then the evening had pulled him into another conversation before they exchanged more than a handful of sentences. He started walking toward her, the walk of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has made peace with going there. Behind her, David and Celeste came out of the conference room. Marcus reached her in the middle of the corridor and stopped. He looked at her, not past her, not at anyone else in that hallway, at her, specifically, in the way that takes up all available attention. He reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat and brought out a small velvet box, dark blue, the shape of which no one in that hallway could have mistaken for anything other than what it was. He went down on one knee on the carpet of the 14th floor of a Park Avenue building at 10:15 on a Thursday morning in October. The hallway went absolutely silent. "I know the timing is not ideal," Marcus said. His voice was low and steady, not performed, just the voice of someone who has thought something through for a long time and has finally decided to stop thinking and say it. "And I know I am asking before you have any real reason to trust me, but your father told me, about 6 months before he passed, that you were the strongest person he had ever known. I believed him when he said it. Watching you walk out of that room just now, I believe it more. I have kept a respectful distance for 2 years because the timing was never right. I am done waiting for the timing to be right. Nora Calloway, will you give me the chance to know you the way you deserve to be known?" The ring inside the box was a round diamond in a plain gold band, not large, not designed to announce itself. The kind of ring chosen by someone thinking about the person and not the impression they want to make. The notary's assistant had come around the corner with a stack of folders and was now standing completely frozen. Diane had gone so quiet that her silence had its own texture. Nora was taking in everything at once, and then, because she could not help it, her eyes moved briefly to Celeste. What she expected was surprise. What she found was something entirely different. Celeste was looking at Marcus with an expression that held no surprise whatsoever. It was old and specific, the expression of a woman who recognizes a man she has genuine history with, and underneath the recognition, barely contained, was something that looked unmistakably like anger, the particular kind of anger you carry when someone you believed you had fully accounted for makes a move that was not in your model. Nora noted it. She set it aside. She looked back at Marcus. He was still on one knee, patient and entirely serious, holding a question he had clearly decided a long time ago he was going to ask. She looked at him for a beat long enough to be real. "Get up," she said quietly, not dismissing him. "The way you speak to someone you are taking seriously. Walk me to the elevator." She turned and walked. Marcus stood without embarrassment, put the box back into his coat, and fell into step beside her. Diane appeared at her other side without a word, present and charged with everything she was holding in reserve for a better moment. They walked to the elevator. The doors opened, and they stepped inside. As the doors slid closed, Nora caught one last look down the hallway. David was standing exactly where he had been when Marcus stood up. He had not moved toward her or away. His expression was the one she had spent 7 years learning to read, the one where his certainty had developed a crack, and he had not yet decided how far the crack went. Celeste had her hand on his arm. Her mouth was moving. His eyes were on the closing doors. The elevator started down. Diane lasted 5 seconds. "Okay," she said. "Don't," Nora said. "I am not going to say anything." "You are already saying something. I am saying one factual thing. He had a ring, not a flashy ring. A real ring. A ring that a person actually thought about before purchasing. I am simply noting this as a factual observation about the last 5 minutes of my life." Marcus was looking straight ahead at the elevator doors with the composure of someone who understands when a moment is not yet his to enter. They walked out into the October morning, cold and sharp and entirely indifferent to what had just happened on the 14th floor. Nora stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building. "I have a great many questions," Diane said. "I know. Starting with how he knew where we would be this morning." "I know." She looked at Marcus. He was waiting with his hands in his pockets and the same patient quality she was beginning to recognize as simply who he was. "Coffee," Nora said. "Both of you. Come on." She turned east and walked, and they followed, and the morning opened up in front of her with the specific quality of something she had not planned for, which was, she realized, the most alive she had felt in quite a long time. Up on the 14th floor, David Whitfield stood at the window of the empty conference room and watched 3 figures on the sidewalk below until they turned a corner and were gone. Celeste was behind him, saying it was theater, that it did not mean anything, that these kinds of gestures were calculated for maximum disruption, and he should not give it more weight than it deserved. He was listening. He was also thinking about the ring, not about its size or its origin, just about the fact of it. A man had stood in a public hallway and made himself completely visible in the most vulnerable possible way, in front of everyone, for a woman he believed was worth that level of exposure. David had been married to that woman for 7 years, and it had never once occurred to him to expose himself that way on her behalf. He thought about that for a while. Of course, he said to something Celeste had said, but his voice, he noticed, did not entirely agree with itself. There was a gap in it, small and quiet. He would carry that gap for longer than he expected. Chapter 2. The quietest woman has the deepest foundation. The night after the courthouse, Nora and Diane sat on the kitchen floor of the West Village apartment with a bottle of wine between them and the neighbor's television coming through the wall at a low, comfortable volume. This had been their tradition since they were 22. Important conversations happened on floors. Diane had established this early, and Nora had never argued with the logic. They had spent more significant hours on floors than anywhere else, including the night Diane's father had his first heart attack, and they had driven to Connecticut in the middle of the night and sat in a hospital corridor until 4 in the morning while Diane talked about everything except the one thing she was afraid to name, and Nora had simply stayed and listened, because sometimes that is the entire thing a person needs from another person. Tonight, Nora was the one talking and Diane was the one listening. "He planned it," Diane said when Nora finished. "He knew the exact time and the exact floor. Someone connected to the estate told him, that is what I think, and you do not find this completely unhinged. A man you met once, at a gala, showing up with a ring. It is unhinged," Nora said. "He said something I cannot stop thinking about." Nora looked at the print on the far wall. Her father's early building elevation, the one she had carried from apartment to apartment for 11 years. She had never been able to take it down because taking it down would have meant deciding she was somewhere permanent, and she had never quite been ready to decide that. He says, "My father told him I was the strongest person he had ever known." Diane went quiet for 5 full seconds. Coming from Diane, 5 seconds of genuine quiet meant she was thinking very hard. "That is deeply unfair of him," she said finally. "Leading with your father in a hallway at 10 in the morning. That is an extremely unfair opening move. He said it at the end. Which is worse? Are you okay? Nora thought about it honestly. I cried for about 20 minutes in the bathroom before you got here. Then I stopped and felt very clear. Clear like you have decided something. Clear like I have decided something. Diane refilled both glasses and stood up and went to the refrigerator with the confidence of someone who has made eggs in another person's kitchen many times before. Nora stayed on the floor and let the evening settle around her and thought about a man on one knee in a hallway and her father's voice saying something to a stranger that she was only now hearing secondhand. She let herself miss him, fully in one concentrated stretch, the way she had learned to do it, so the grief did not leak sideways at wrong moments. Then she put it away and thought about what came next. Walter Chin had managed the Calloway family's legal affairs for 23 years. He was precise and careful, and he stood up when Nora walked into his office the next morning in the specific way of someone who has been holding something on behalf of another person for a long time and is finally placing it into the right hands. What he laid out was larger than she had known. Her father had spent the last 6 years building towards something in the quiet, methodical way he did everything. 18 months ago, Calloway Design Group had won the Riverside Commons Commission, 14 blocks of urban redevelopment along the Hudson in Lower Manhattan, the largest single design contract the city had offered in a generation. The contract was active, waiting only for Nora's signature as the new principal owner to be fully operative. She sat with that for a moment. He did not tell me, she said. He wanted to tell you in person, Walter said. He was going to call you the week the award came through. That was the week he went into the hospital. Her father had won the most significant commission of his career and had died before he could tell his daughter about it, and she had been so careful to stay away from the part of her life that hurt to be near, that she had not been close enough to know it was happening. She sat with that too. She gave it its full weight. There is one more thing, Walter said, opening a second folder. Before the Riverside bid, Marcus Hale approached your father about a co-development arrangement. Rather than competing, they combined their proposals. Calloway leads design and community engagement. Hale handles development, infrastructure, and financing. He looked at his notes. Your father wrote to me during the negotiations. He said Marcus Hale was someone who understands that the work is the point and not the deal. He said he had not been able to say that about a development partner in many years. Nora was quiet for a moment. My father trusted him, she said. He did, which, in 23 years of knowing your father, was not something he did quickly. Then Walter mentioned, almost as a final item, that a firm called Harlan Bridge Partners had sent an inquiry 3 weeks prior about acquiring a stake in the Riverside project. His team had traced the money behind it. It led directly back to the Harrington family investment structure. He said it simply and let it land. Nora heard it and felt the first piece of a larger shape slide quietly into place. She put on her coat, thanked Walter, and went out onto Lexington Avenue. She called Diane from the sidewalk. I need to tell you something, she said. She laid it out. When she finished, Diane was quiet for a moment. She was never in it for David, Diane said. She was in it for the firm, Nora said. David was the path. I was the obstacle, which is either better or worse than what you thought. It is clarifying, Nora said, and clarity is the useful thing right now. That evening, she met Marcus at a coffee shop on Hudson Street she had been coming to since her 20s. They talked about the Riverside timeline for 20 minutes, and then a natural pause settled between them. Can I ask something that is not about the project? He said. Depending on what it is, she said. What did you think of the ring? He said it with a completely straight face. She was beginning to understand that his straight face was not a wall, but a window. the expression of someone who meant what he said without needing to perform it. It was a good ring, she said. I looked at quite a few. I believe that. She looked at him. My father trusted you. Walter told you that. Walter told me what my father wrote. My father died before he had the chance to say it to me himself. A pause. He was going to call me the week the award came through. That was the week he went into the hospital. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The coffee shop moved around them. Someone's order called. A door opening and letting in a gust of October air. The window seat, he said. She looked at him. In the reading room at the Bronx Community Center. Your father designed a window seat into the north-facing wall, low to the ground. Storage built in underneath. He told me he measured the height specifically. He turned his cup slightly on the table. He measured it against a 10-year-old girl who used to come to the office after school and sit in the corner with a book for 2 hours while he worked. Nora went very still. That was me, she said. I know, Marcus said. That is why he told me. She looked at the table, then at the man across from her. You should know, she said, that I am in no position to make any permanent decision about anything right now. I signed divorce papers yesterday. I inherited a company this afternoon. My footing is not what anyone would call solid ground. I know that, he said. I am not asking for a permanent decision. I am asking if you will let me buy you coffee again sometime. You already bought me coffee tonight. Then I am asking if you will let me do it again. She looked at him. We will see, she said. Which, walking home an hour later in the October cold, she acknowledged to herself, was considerably more than no. Her phone buzzed as she turned onto her street. A message from her attorney forwarding something from David's lawyer. A carefully worded inquiry suggesting the Calloway estate may not have been fully disclosed during the divorce settlement proceedings. She stood on the sidewalk and read it twice. It had moved faster than she expected, which told her one thing clearly. Someone had prompted it. Someone had given David a specific reason to push before he would have found one on his own. She put the phone away and kept walking. She had a press conference to schedule. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Came to Win, Not Love. The Hudson Yards benefit was on a Friday evening in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and the river going dark outside, and Nora had been on the guest list since March, back when she was still Nora Whitfield, and had accepted the invitation as a professional obligation she had not particularly looked forward to. Now she was going as the new principal of the firm that had sponsored the event for 6 consecutive years. It was her first public appearance in that capacity. Diane had offered to do her hair. Nora had let her. The room was full of people she knew in the layered, sideways way of professional worlds. Faces connected to names, connected to past projects and events, where she had made careful conversation and come away knowing very little of substance. For 7 years, she had moved through rooms like this as David Whitfield's wife, which carried its own kind of visibility, present but not quite the point, context for someone else's story. Tonight was different. She felt it in the first 20 minutes. Diane stayed close for the first hour, moving through the room with the social ease of someone who has spent a career in spaces like this. She kept Nora in her peripheral vision without appearing to. Nora was near the window, talking with an architect she had known from years before when she felt a change in the room's pressure, not a sound, a shift. She knew the source without looking directly at it. Celeste arrived at her side during a natural break in the conversation, as if she had simply been passing by on her way somewhere else. Nora, she said warmly, I did not realize you would be here tonight. The firm has been a sponsor for 6 years. Nora said. Of course. Celeste looked around the room with the appreciation of a woman who is comfortable everywhere she goes. Then her gaze came back to Nora, and the warmth in it became something more precise and deliberate. I heard about your father's firm, the inheritance. That must be an enormous thing to step into, especially right now. A small pause. The Riverside project in particular. The clients at that level expect institutional continuity, relationships built over years, a specific vision they came to trust. Your father had such a particular way of working. Another pause. Perfectly placed. It is just a lot to carry in cold. Without having been in the day-to-day, I think people will understand if the first year is more about finding your footing than delivering. Every word was defensible. Every word was precisely aimed. What it said, underneath the concerned surface, was this: you do not belong here. You have been away too long. You did not build this, and the room can see that. She had also, without meaning to, told Nora something important. She knew about Riverside. She knew specifics about the client relationships and the firm's working culture that she should not have known unless she had been paying close attention to Callaway Design Group's business for some time. The firm is in excellent shape, Nora said. I am looking forward to the work. Of course you are, Celeste said warmly. Of course. She moved on to rejoin a group near the center of the room with the ease of someone who has completed a task and is satisfied with how it went. Diane materialized at Nora's side before the next breath. What did she say? Diane said. Useful things. Nora said. The kind that tell you exactly what someone is worried about. Diane looked across the room at Celeste. She is too comfortable. A woman whose former fiancé just proposed to another woman on divorce day should register some disruption. She is registering none. Nora turned her head. What did you say? Former fiancé, Diane said, lowering her voice. I looked him up properly after Thursday. Marcus Hale and Celeste Harrington were engaged about 2.5 years ago. She ended it. And I found photographs from that year. Industry events. Functions that would have put Marcus in the same room as your father. On at least one occasion, the room shifted in Nora's understanding. Not dramatically. Like a photograph coming into focus when you adjust the lens correctly. She looked across the space at Celeste, laughing at something someone had said, perfectly at ease. She was not surprised to see him in the hallway Thursday morning. Nora said quietly. No, Diane said. She recognized him the way you recognize someone whose next move you believed you had already mapped. Nora looked at the window and the dark river beyond it. She had been thinking about this as a personal story. A husband who chose someone else. A marriage that ended. What she was looking at now was a business calculation in which she had been the obstacle and not the point. On Saturday morning, Walter confirmed it. The money behind Harlan Bridge Partners traced directly back to the Heiress family investment structure. One clear documented line. Nora sat at her kitchen table with Walter's email open on her laptop and read through the connection a second time. And then she put the laptop down and sat back in her chair and let herself feel what it actually was, not as a sequence of logical steps, but as a thing that had happened to her, to her marriage, to the last 7 years of her life. Someone had looked at her father's firm, had understood what the Riverside Commission meant and what it was worth, had understood that the clearest path to it ran through the woman who would inherit the firm, and that the most effective way to reach that woman was to make sure she was occupied with something else entirely when the moment came to move. Her marriage had not failed because David fell in love with someone else. Her marriage had been a door that someone built in the shape of an existing weakness and then walked through deliberately. She sat with that. She had cried in this kitchen 11 days ago for a marriage she thought she had lost. Now she understood that part of what she had been crying for was something that had been compromised from the outside long before David made his choice. Part of her grief had been for something that was never fully what she thought it was. That was a different kind of loss. smaller in some ways, larger in others, the kind that requires you to sit with it before you know what to do with it. She sat with it for exactly as long as it needed. Then she put on her coat, called David from the front door of her building, and said one thing: ask Celeste directly about Harlan Bridge Partners. Ask her to explain the connection between that firm and her family's investment holdings. Then pay attention to how long it takes her to answer and whether she looks at you while she does it. Nora, he said, something in his voice she had not expected, not defensiveness. The sound of a man standing in a room that has started to feel wrong. That is all, she said. Do what you want with it. She took the subway to Spring Street. She stood on the opposite sidewalk and looked at the Callaway Design Group building, her father's name above the entrance, lights on in the upper floors, staff working on a Saturday because the work required it. Then she went inside. The building was quiet. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked down the hall to the door at the far end, her father's office. She had not been inside since he died. She stood outside the door. She thought about what Celeste had said at the benefit, that she had been away too long, that she was coming in cold, that the work required a continuity she did not have. She thought about sitting in the corner of this office after school with a book while her father worked, the two of them in the same room without needing to fill it with conversation. She thought about him measuring the height of her knees off the floor and building that measurement into a wall in a community center in the Bronx because he believed precisely enough in what a 10-year-old girl needed to read undisturbed that he put it into the architecture itself. She thought about standing in this hallway for 4 months without being able to open this door. She opened it. The office smelled of drafting paper and cedar pencils and the particular quality of a space where someone spent years doing work they cared about deeply. The white ceramic mug sat on the desk, upside down on a folded paper towel, the way Patricia had left it. Pencil drawings of his early buildings were on the walls. On the drafting table in the corner, a roll of sketches held closed by a rubber band she recognized immediately. The Riverside preliminary concepts, the ones he had shown her 8 months ago and asked her opinion on, the ones where she had caught the wind corridor problem in the north elevation and told him so, and he had argued with her for 4 minutes and then gone quiet and admitted she was right. She walked to the desk and sat down in his chair. She sat there for a while, not moving through the grief efficiently or trying to extract a lesson before it was ready, just sitting in the room where someone she loved had done the best work of his life and letting herself understand what it meant that he had left it to her. She picked up her phone. Schedule the press conference, she told Walter. Announce the firm leadership and the Riverside partnership in the same release. Have the Harlan Bridge documentation ready for the attorneys to act on starting Wednesday. She set the phone down. She looked at the mug, at the drawings, at the Riverside sketches. Okay, Dad, she said quietly. She had been small for long enough. That was done now. Chapter 4. The day the whole city saw her name. The conference room on the 4th floor of Callaway Design Group held photographs on its walls that Raymond Callaway had chosen himself, not architectural renderings. Actual photographs of completed buildings taken years after they opened, showing people using them for what they had been built for, a community center in the Bronx, with children running through the main hall, a library in Brooklyn with a woman reading by a north-facing window, a mixed-use development in Harlem where the same small businesses had occupied the ground floor retail for 6 years because a designer had structured the rents to make that continuity possible. Nora stood at the back of the room on Wednesday morning, looking at the photographs while Patricia and the communications team arranged chairs for the journalists coming upstairs. Marcus came in early. He crossed the room and stood beside her and they looked at the photographs together for a moment. The way you look at something that deserves a beat of silence before words are useful. He told me about the library in Brooklyn, Marcus said. The woman who runs the children's reading program sent him a letter the week the building opened. He kept it in his desk for years. He kept everything, Nora said. Every letter, every note. He said, a building is only finished when someone tells you what they do inside it. He said that to me too. In our second meeting, he said it like a statement of belief, which I later understood was his version of a test. Nora looked at the photograph of the woman at the north window. What did he tell you about me? She said. All of it. Marcus was quiet for a moment in the way he was when a question deserved its full weight of thought. He said, you caught something in the Riverside sketches in 20 minutes that he had been quietly troubled by for weeks and could not name, the wind corridor on the north edge. He said he knew you were right before you finished the sentence. He argued with me for 4 minutes before he admitted it. He told me that too. He said that was how he always knew when an answer was correct. If it was wrong, he would agree too quickly. If it was right, he would push back first. Patricia appeared in the doorway. 8 journalists were ready downstairs. Nora picked up her folder. Thank you, she said to Marcus. For today specifically, I wanted you to know who you are before you walked into that room, he said. The people downstairs are going to form an impression of you in the next 30 minutes. You should know yourself first. She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked out. The press conference ran 22 minutes. Nora introduced herself as the new principal of Callaway Design Group and the daughter of Raymond W. Callaway and spoke about the Riverside Commons project and the Hale Architecture partnership with the specificity of someone who had read every document and understood every line. She talked about the design philosophy her father had built the firm around, that every decision a designer makes is an argument about what a community is worth, and that she intended to keep making that argument loudly and in public, and with 14 blocks along the Hudson as the proof of it near the end. A reporter from the architecture desk asked the question she had been waiting for. You have been away from the firm for 7 years. Some partners may have concerns about institutional continuity. How do you plan to address that? The room went slightly quieter. People had been waiting to see how she would handle this question. Nora looked at the reporter directly. I caught a structural problem in the Riverside preliminary sketches 8 months ago. In a 20-minute conversation with my father, he had been looking at those sketches for weeks, she said. She paused. I was not away from this firm for 7 years. I was away from this office. Those are different things. A beat of silence. Then, the same way my father established trust with every client he ever had, by doing the work well enough that people stop asking the question. The room absorbed that for a moment. She took 6 more minutes of questions and answered each one without hedging. Walking out, she felt the specific shift in the air that happens when people have updated their understanding of who they are dealing with. Not applause, something steadier and more durable. The quiet satisfaction of being seen accurately for the first time in a long while. Marcus was at the back of the room. He had said nothing and signaled nothing. He was simply there, which, she had come to understand, was what he did instead. Across town, David was alone in a conference room after his afternoon meeting had cleared out. He had been developing the habit of staying in empty rooms when he could get one. They were the only places where he was not required to perform any particular version of himself. His phone was face up on the table. When the notification came through, he opened it and read. The headline was direct. Raymond Callaway's daughter takes the helm at Callaway Design Group. Riverside Commons Commission moves forward under new leadership. He read the piece through once. The Riverside Project, the partnership with Hale Architecture, the press conference. the firm's position, and what the commission represented. And then he found the part about the legal inquiry, and he read that section twice. His attorney's letter described briefly and accurately the simultaneous response from Nora's estate team, identifying the inquiry as originating from parties with a competing financial interest in the firm, with documentation attached. The documentation tracing that interest back to the Harrington family. He set the phone face down on the table. He thought about the Sunday morning she had raised the concern, Celeste at the breakfast table, her hands around a coffee mug, her voice carrying exactly the warmth it always carried, saying she did not want to overstep, but that someone who cared about him ought to raise this. He had taken the reason she offered him because it was packaged in a form that let him feel like he was protecting himself. He had not asked the questions that would have made the reason fall apart because he had not wanted the reason to fall apart. He picked up his phone and called her. She answered on the second ring. When he said Harlan Bridge Partners and asked her directly, she did not hesitate. Her voice stayed completely level. She held his attention with the ease of someone who has done this many times. She said it was a distant family investment vehicle. These structures were always more complex than they appeared from outside, and what he was looking at looked to her like someone framing a coincidence as a scheme, because it served a very convenient purpose at a very convenient time. She was absolutely steady throughout, perfect, in the specific way of something that has been rehearsed until it no longer sounds rehearsed. He said, of course, and ended the call. He sat there and thought about the quality of her steadiness. He had watched people say untrue things before. They usually gave something away somewhere, a word that came slightly too fast, a look that went sideways for half a second. Celeste had given him none of those signals, and something about that perfection felt wrong. The small particular wrong of something that looks exactly right but has no texture underneath it. He had signed that letter. He had handed himself a reason and not examined the reason. He was sitting now in an empty room with a phone in his hand and the understanding, arriving slowly and without any mercy, that he had allowed himself to be used in a direction he would not have chosen if he had been paying proper attention. He did not move for a long time. The empty room held whatever it held, without comment, without mercy, the way empty rooms do. Celeste read the coverage in a car going uptown and processed it with the focused precision of someone assessing a situation that has moved outside the model. The documentation being public was manageable in isolation. What was not manageable was the speed. Nora had announced the partnership and the leadership simultaneously, had closed the public narrative before any counter-story had room to breathe. She had one move remaining, the kind that, once made, revealed something about your willingness that could not be concealed afterward. But she was no longer in a position where restraint was improving anything. She made the call. She described a personal connection between Nora and Marcus that appeared to possibly predate the conclusion of the divorce. Not confirmed. It was not true. She knew that with complete clarity, but a story placed Friday evening could do significant work over a weekend before the checking began. She ended the call. She gave herself one breath to look at what she had just done. Then she looked out at the city going by and thought about what came next. Chapter 5. She walked in first. She walked out whole. The planted story ran Friday evening and collapsed by Sunday afternoon. The Journal reporter who had covered the press conference was already deep in the Harlan Bridge documentation when the story landed. He traced the formal letter of intent between Callaway Design Group and Hale Architecture from its filing date, which was 17 months before the divorce was finalized. The arithmetic was not ambiguous. 2 of the 3 outlets that had published the item issued corrections by Saturday night. The third went quiet. which was the understated version of the same conclusion. Walter forwarded the corrections to Nora without comment. From Walter, this was the equivalent of considerable satisfaction. Nora closed the tab and made coffee and stood at her window and looked at the Saturday morning. Dog walkers. The deli across the street already busy. Gray clean light coming off the Hudson. She thought about what was still in front of her. Two things. She had known what they were since Wednesday, and she was not going to manage her way around either of them. The Harrington family annual business lunch had been listed in the Journal's calendar for 3 weeks. 40 business partners and institutional associates gathered every October at the Prescott Hotel on Park Avenue, a tradition Celeste's father had started in the 90s. The opinion of the people in that room had a direct bearing on the Harrington family's actual financial position. All 40 of them would be there at noon. Nora chose a dark blue dress, not for what it communicated, because it was the one she felt most like herself in. She called Diane at 9. "I need someone with me today," she said. "I will be there in 20 minutes, Diane said, without asking why. This was one of the reasons Nora had kept her close for 11 years. They took a cab uptown, and Diane watched Nora's face during the ride. "How are you doing this?" Diane said finally. "I am going to walk into a room and tell the truth to the people who need to hear it," Nora said. "That is all this is." In front of 40 of her closest business associates. 40 of her closest business associates are exactly the people who need to be in the room when the truth is told. That is specifically the point. Diane looked at her for a long moment. "Your father would have loved this." "I know," Nora said. The Prescott was pale marble and good flowers, and the trained discretion of staff who have seen everything and regard all of it as ordinary. Nora gave the room number at the front desk and took the stairs. The lunch was deep into its second hour. Plates cleared, conversation loose and comfortable. The formal business portion finished, and the room in the easy mood of people enjoying familiar company. She came through the door. She and Celeste saw each other at precisely the same moment. Celeste moved immediately, not toward the exit, far too controlled for that. She rose from the center table and crossed the room toward Nora with the purposeful ease of someone who intends to intercept a situation before it reaches the wrong part of the room. Her voice, when she got close enough, was low and entirely level. "This is not the appropriate time or place for whatever you are considering. If you have something to raise, we can step outside and handle it correctly. I think this is the correct place," Nora said. "The people in this room do business with your family. They have a right to accurate information. There are proper channels for concerns like these." "I went through proper channels," Nora said. "Your family's interests sent an inquiry through my former husband's attorney to my estate attorney. I am using the proper channel now." She walked past Celeste to the center table and sat down in the empty chair directly across from Celeste's place setting. The table went quiet. The tables around it began to register the change in atmosphere. Celeste followed and sat down with her spine straight and her expression composed in the way that had clearly taken considerable practice to maintain under pressure. She looked around at the faces at the table, people who had been in rooms with her family for years, and something in her posture communicated the quiet authority of someone who is about to handle an unfortunate situation gracefully. "I want to be direct with everyone here," Celeste said, reaching for the room before Nora could. "We are witnessing something that I think most of you will recognize. Someone in the middle of a painful personal transition, looking for an explanation that makes the difficulty feel less random. I understand the impulse. I genuinely do." Her voice was warm and measured and almost convincing, but I would ask everyone to consider the circumstances before attaching weight to what is about to be presented. Several people at the table shifted slightly. not away from Celeste. Just the small physical adjustment of people who are no longer certain which way to lean. Nora opened the folder. The first page went on the table between them. This is a summary of the Harrington Capital Management portfolio from the most recent filing period, the debt-to-asset ratio, the outstanding obligations on the development properties in New Jersey and Connecticut, the projected liquidity for the next 18 months. All public filings, all traceable. The man sitting directly across from Celeste's chair was Robert Devlin. He was 62 and had been doing business with the Harrington family for 18 years. He looked down at the page. The second page went beside the first. This is the structure of Harlan Bridge Partners, the firm that sent an inquiry to my estate attorney 3 weeks ago about acquiring a stake in the Riverside Commons project. The money behind it traces back to the Harrington family investment holdings. The documentation is public, and anyone who looks can find it. Celeste's voice came back immediately, smooth and certain. These numbers are presented without the context that would make them meaningful. This is a selective snapshot designed to create a false impression. She looked around the table again, reaching for the trust she had built in this room across many years. I would ask each of you to consider who is presenting this and why, and what purpose is served by this particular timing. Robert Devlin picked up the first page. He read it slowly and completely. He set it down and picked up the second. He read that too. He sets both pages back on the table. He looked at Celeste. Celeste, he said, just her name. The way you say a name when you need someone to stop talking. Celeste turned to him. Robert, I want you to understand what is actually happening here. This is a deliberate attempt by someone with very clear motivation to misrepresent our position. You and I have worked together for nearly 2 decades. You know how these numbers can be framed to tell any story someone wants to tell. I have been looking at some of these figures independently for the past several weeks, Devlin said. His voice was not accusatory. It was simply the voice of a man stating what is true. The Connecticut properties specifically. I had questions I was planning to raise privately. I was waiting for the right moment. A beat of silence. A woman at the table, Caroline Marsh, who had been a consistent partner of the Harrington family for more than 10 years, set her wine glass down with a careful, deliberate movement. I have had the same questions, Caroline said. She was looking at the page Devlin had set down. Her voice was measured and entirely calm. I was also waiting for the appropriate moment to raise them. Celeste looked at Devlin. She looked at Caroline. She looked at the others around the table. 2 people, 2 separate people at this table. Her table, the table she had been sitting at in this room for years, saying they had already been asking the same questions privately. She made one more attempt. It was the move of someone who has very little left, but is not yet willing to show it. What you are both describing, she said, keeping her voice level, keeping it warm, keeping it everything it had always been in this room, is a normal cycle of portfolio adjustment in a complex investment environment. Every family office in this city manages similar pressures. The difference is that most of them are not subjected to this kind of public pressure from someone with a personal grievance. I am asking for the same good faith you have extended to us for years. The room was quiet. And then Robert Devlin, 62 years old, 18 years of business with the Harrington family, set down the 2 pages on the table and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, I think the good faith has to go both ways. Celeste sat with that. She held her posture. She held her expression. She was extraordinarily skilled, and she held everything she knew how to hold. But the room was gone. She could feel it. The 40 people she had built her entire morning around, the trust she had spent years accumulating in this specific space, had shifted its weight in one direction, and it was not hers. She looked at Nora. and something came off her face that had never come off her face in any room Nora had been in with her. Not the mask exactly, the effort of maintaining it, visible now in a way it had never been before, and underneath the effort, something that looked very much like the exhaustion of someone who has been holding a great deal together for a very long time and has run out of hands. I needed the commission, she said. She said it quietly, aimed at Nora and not at the table, as though the 40 people in the room had temporarily ceased to exist. The family needed it. The Riverside Project would have covered obligations that cannot be sustained much longer otherwise. A pause. You were just sitting on it. The room absorbed that sentence in complete silence. Nora was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone searching for words, the quiet of someone deciding which true thing to say out of all the true things available. My father designed a window seat in a building in the Bronx, she said, low to the ground, north-facing light, storage built in underneath. He designed it to the exact height of a 10-year-old girl so she could sit with her feet flat and a book in her lap and stay there for as long as she needed. He built that specific measurement into a public building so that decades later, children who had never heard his name could sit there and feel held by something they could not name. That is what he was building. That is what he spent 40 years making. That is what you wanted to acquire. She looked at Celeste directly. I need you to understand that what you were sitting on when you look at Harlan Bridge Partners and what my father was building when he won that commission are not the same kind of thing. They were never the same kind of thing. The room was completely still. After a moment, Nora gathered the folder and stood. I am sorry about the family finances, she said. That is a real problem, and I genuinely hope you find a real solution to it. A pause. This was not one. She looked at Robert Devlin and at Caroline Marsh and at the others around the table. The full documentation is available through Walter Chin at the firm managing the Callaway estate. He will respond to any inquiries directly. She walked out. Diane was in the lobby near the marble columns, positioned where she had a clear line of sight to the stairs. She fell into step beside Nora without speaking until they pushed through the hotel's front doors and the Saturday afternoon opened around them, cold and bright and entirely itself. What happened? Diane said. 2 people at the table had already been asking the same questions privately, Nora said. And she said something true at the end. What did she say? Nora told her. Diane walked beside her quietly for a moment. Do you feel sorry for her? She said. Not exactly, Nora said. I understand her, which is different and almost more tiring. Diane put her hand on Nora's arm and kept it there for a moment without saying anything, which was sometimes the most Diane thing she did, and always the thing Nora was most grateful for. 2 more things, Nora said. I know, Diane said. David was sitting on the bench outside the Callaway Design Group building when Nora came around the corner on Spring Street. Patricia had texted at 10:30 to let her know he was there. He had arrived at 9 and had not asked to go upstairs. He had sat on the bench and waited, which told her something specific and important about the version of himself he had brought today. He stood when he saw her coming. She sat down on the bench and he sat beside her, and they were 2 people on an ordinary sidewalk, with the Saturday afternoon going on around them. The coffee shop across the street, a family with a stroller, the city doing what it always did. I withdrew the legal letter first thing this morning, he said, before 8. Walter told me. I know he would. He looked at his hands for a moment. I drove past the brownstone last night, West 72nd. I am not entirely sure why. I just found myself going that direction. Nora said nothing. The light was on in the second-floor window, he said. The reading room. Whoever is renting now has a chair in the same spot yours was. I sat in the car outside for a few minutes. He stopped. I had been telling myself for a long time that you were fine in that house, that you were content, that the end of the marriage was simply both of us needing something different. I had been saying it often enough that I had started to believe it. And sitting outside, she said, the story did not hold anymore. Neither of them spoke for a moment. A delivery truck went by on Spring Street, doing its ordinary business. I did not know about Celeste and the firm, he said. The inquiry, Harlan Bridge. Any of it. I need you to know that. I know you did not, she said. But I signed the letter. She told me it was due diligence, and I believed her because I wanted the reason she was offering me. I did not ask the questions that would have made the reason fall apart. You trusted someone who was giving you what you wanted to hear, Nora said. That is not the same as inventing a motive, but it is not blameless either. No, he said, it is not. He looked at the building across from them, her father's name above the entrance, Raymond W. I never once asked you to show me what he built, he said, in 7 years. You are the daughter of a man who designed window seats to fit a specific child, and I never once asked you to take me through one of his buildings and show me what he made. He stopped. I do not know exactly when I stopped being curious about who you actually were, but I know it happened, and I know I let it happen, and I know now that it was the thing that cost me the most. I made you into a story about my own limitations, he continued. For years, I told myself you were a ceiling on the life I deserved, and I used that story to justify walking away from someone who deserved a great deal better. I am not saying this expecting anything from it. I am saying it because it is true, and I have been trying to say true things. I let it happen, she said. I chose to be smaller because the conversation we would have had otherwise felt too costly. We both made choices. Yours were better, eventually, she said. He almost smiled. It was the most unguarded expression she had seen from him in a long time. She stood. He stood when she did, and they faced each other on the sidewalk in front of the building. Her father built. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, he said. She went through the door. He sat back down on the bench. He looked up at Raymond W. Calloway on the building across from him and sat there for a while, alone on the sidewalk with the Saturday afternoon. And he thought about 7 years of being in the same house as someone and never once asking her to show him what her father made. He sat with it until he was done sitting with it. Then he stood and walked, and the city absorbed him as it absorbs everyone, without comment and without judgment, which is both the hardest and the most merciful thing about it. That night, Nora met Marcus at the restaurant on West Broadway that had become, over the past 2 weeks, the place they went when neither of them wanted to be, somewhere that required anything beyond the conversation itself. He was already there when she arrived. She sat down across from him and felt, simply and without complication, glad to be there. She told him how the day had gone, the hotel and the 2 pages on the table, Devlin saying Celeste's name in that specific quiet way, Caroline Marsh setting down her glass, what Celeste said when the room stopped being hers, the window seat, and saying it out loud in front of 40 people, and what it felt like to name the right thing in the right room at the right time. David on the bench and the brownstone window, and the things he had managed to say. Marcus listened without filling the spaces before she finished them. How do you feel? He said when she was done. Like I have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have set it down at the place I was always carrying it to, she said. That specific kind of tired, the useful kind, he said. They sat with that for a moment. The restaurant moved around them in its ordinary Saturday night way. Tell me about the Riverside North elevation, she said, the revised version. I want to know if you solved the wind corridor the same way my father would have or differently. He looked at her. You want to talk about the project. I want to know how you think, she said. He considered. I changed the grade of the roofline on the corner building at Chambers Street rather than adjusting the overall height. It solves the corridor without taking light from the residential building going up behind it next spring. You solved for a building that does not exist yet. I solved for the people who have not moved in yet, he said, which is the same thing. She looked at him. My father said those exact words to me, she said, when I was about 14. He said we are not building for who lives there now. We are building for the people who have not arrived yet. He said the same thing to me in our second meeting, Marcus said. When I was explaining the roofline revision, he stopped me halfway through. He said, you are solving for the people who have not moved in yet. He said it like a fact that should need no explanation. Did it feel like a test? She said. It felt like a statement of belief, he said, which I later understood was his version of the same thing. She looked at the table for a moment, then at him. I want to ask you something, she said. He waited. When you say you want to know me the way I deserve to be known, what does that mean to you? He thought about it the way he always thought about questions that deserved that kind of attention. Then he said, it means being in the room when things are difficult and not only when they are easy. It means asking the questions I actually want to ask rather than the ones that are more convenient. It means understanding that someone who made herself quiet for a long time is not a quiet person, and paying attention to the difference. A pause. It means noticing the window seat. She looked at him. Yes, she said. He looked back at her. To what you asked in the hallway, she said. I am saying yes to that, not to the ring yet. That is still a considerable thing to say yes to on the 14th day of knowing someone. But yes to what you actually asked. Yes to the chance. Marcus was quiet, but it was a different quiet than the one she had come to associate with him. Not the patient, managed quiet of someone in control. A quieter quiet than that. The quiet of someone who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. He looked at the table for a moment before he looked at her. I want to tell you something about the hallway, he said. All right, she said. I was not as certain as I looked. He said it plainly, without apology or performance. I had been thinking about asking you for months. I had decided to wait for a better moment. When you knew me better, when it would be less strange. And then that morning came, and I was standing in the lobby of that building, telling myself to wait. And I could not make myself wait anymore. He looked at her. I had the ring in my pocket. I had not planned to use it that day. And then I saw you come out of that conference room, and I thought, if not now, then when? And I stopped thinking, and I went. Were you scared? She said. Yes, he said, genuinely scared. I did not show it well. You showed it not at all, she said. I know, that is one of my less useful habits. A pause. I will try to do better. She looked at him for a moment, then she smiled. Not the composed near smile she had been wearing through most of these 2 weeks. An actual smile. The kind that catches you slightly off guard because it arrived before you planned it. The kind she had not had cause for in quite a long time. That is the most human thing you have said to me, she told him. Good, he said. And when he said it this time, the word carried something different than it had before, something lighter and warmer and considerably less managed, something that had been held carefully for a long time and was now, with this one word on a Saturday night in a small restaurant on West Broadway, being gently and completely released. They stayed for 2 more hours. They talked about the Riverside project and about her father and about buildings Marcus had designed in other cities, and what she thought of them, and what he thought of her answers. They talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. It was the first evening she had spent with him, not organized around something external, not a legal situation or a business meeting that happened to reveal something personal. 2 people simply finding out about each other, which was its own kind of beginning and felt exactly like one. She walked home. The October night was cold and sharp and entirely itself. She walked up Hudson and turned east on Spring Street and came to the corner where the Callaway Design Group building stood and looked up at it the way she had been looking at it differently since the week she first used her key card and came through the front door as its owner. She went inside, through the quiet building, into the elevator, down the third-floor hall to the door at the far end. She opened it. The north light was gone for the night. The windows held the city instead of the sky, the mug on the desk, the drawings on the walls, the roll of Riverside sketches on the drafting table with her notes in the margins from 8 months ago, her own handwriting, identifying the problem that had been too close to see until she walked in and caught it in 20 minutes. She sat down in his chair. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered before the second ring. "I am in his office," she said. A pause on the line that was not empty. "I know," he said. "He told me once that you would know when you were ready to sit at that desk. He said he trusted you to know it without being told." Nora looked at the mug, at the drawings, at the Riverside sketches he had made for a project he did not live to see finished, which now had her name on the contract and her to notes in the margins, and every decision going forward hers to make as she saw fit. She looked at the city through the north window, the lights of lower Manhattan going all the way to the water. 10,000 lives in 10,000 windows, every single one their own story going forward in whatever direction they were pointed. "Come over," she said. "I want to show you something in the sketches, the north elevation. There is something I want to talk through in person. I will be there in 15 minutes, Marcus said. She set the phone down on the desk. She looked at the room, at everything in it that was now hers to carry and to continue. The mug and the drawings and the Riverside sketches her father had made for a project he trusted her to finish. The window seat story that had traveled from a corner of this office to a wall in the Bronx to a coffee shop on Hudson Street to a hallway where someone had asked her the right question at what appeared to be the wrong time and which was, she now understood, exactly the right time. The way those things always work when someone has been paying close enough attention. She was going to build what her father built. She was going to build it better than she could have before any of this happened, because she was not the same person who had spent 7 years making herself smaller. That person had been real, and she did not dismiss her. But she was someone different now, someone who had walked into a hotel dining room and sat down at the wrong table and said the right true thing in front of 40 people because it needed to be said. Someone who had sat on a bench and had a real conversation and said what was true without adding anything extra. Someone who had opened a door she had been standing outside for 4 months and sat down in a chair that was now hers to sit in. That was who she was now. She turned on the desk lamp and unrolled the Riverside sketches across the desk and smoothed them flat with both hands and looked at the north elevation with her note in the margin from 8 months ago, identifying the problem that her father had been too close to see. Outside, the river was dark at its edges and lit at its crossings, and the buildings on either side held 10,000 separate lives going forward in 10,000 separate windows. And the city kept doing the only thing it had ever known how to do. It kept moving. It kept making room. It kept going forward without asking anyone's permission or waiting for a better moment, because there is no better moment than the one that is already here, inside the office. Nora Callaway sat at her father's desk, with his drawings around her, and the city in the north window and the Riverside sketches spread under the lamp, and the next part of her life was 15 minutes away and entirely on its way. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly the start it was supposed to be.